Resident Evil 6 is considered by many the dark ages of Resident Evil, the lowest point imaginable, the worst game in the franchise. And I want to ask the question, is that really true? Now, listen, I've definitely been in that crowd. I was there day one when it released on the PS3, and by day one, I mean like an entire week before it actually released, because I knew somebody who knew a guy and we knew how to make certain games work before they were ever released on the Xbox 360, but we'll not get into that. So obviously I completed it before it ever released, and I knew what was coming out. I knew what this game was. Once the reviews hit, I just knew it was going to be terrible. I knew across the board people weren't going to be happy with it, and I definitely wasn't happy with it. Day one, Resident Evil 6 didn't have just a problem with what it was trying to be. It had a problem technically too. The field of view was up your anus. You had really bad QTE sections. It was just an absolute ball ache to play, and not a very good time from start to finish. And when you're coming off a game like Resident Evil 5, where it also has a bit of an identity crisis, but when you look at Resident Evil 5 at its core, it's a superb quality video game. Then you play a game like Resident Evil 6, it's not quite sure what it wants to be. It has way too many ideas all blended together to make an absolute hot mess of a video game. You get Resident Evil 6, it doesn't know whether it wants to be a horror game, it doesn't know whether it wants to be an action game, it doesn't know if it wants to be like an arcade game with the amount of stuff you do in this game. It just doesn't quite know whether it's coming or going. Now, I was the type of person that when this game first came out, I wanted survival horror. I was elitist, fanboy, survival horror type guy, where it was like Resident Evil as a survival horror game. I didn't even like Resident Evil 4 at the time. I really fell out of love with that game. Resident Evil 5 I wasn't big on. And Resident Evil 6 really just pushed me over the edge where Resident Evil was concerned, and I was just kind of like done with it. But I was playing Resident Evil 6 as if I was trying to play a survival horror game, and Resident Evil 6 is anything but. So, why do I keep playing this game? Now, history doesn't repeat itself. I have changed so much since back then. I've accepted that Resident Evil 4 is the best game in the franchise. I know some people are still coming to terms with that. And I also accept that Resident Evil 5 is a hell of a good time. Like I said, my actions didn't match my words. I kept playing Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 5 was probably my most played game that generation. And then Resident Evil 6 came along, and it's like I keep playing it. Even though I make jokes about Resident Evil 6 left and right, I keep coming back to it. I keep trying it over and over again to play it. And you know what? I think I just have to come to terms as Resident Evil 6 really isn't that bad of a game. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting here telling you it's a good game, and I'm definitely not recommending that everyone plays it. It's an extremely janky video game from start to finish. It has some of the coolest control that I just don't think any third-person shooter's even attempted to replicate. God knows why. The rolling on the floor, the shooting from the down position, you can jump backwards, the quick shot, the numerous melee options you've got depending on where you shoot the enemy. There's just so much to do with the gameplay that I absolutely love about Resident Evil 6. But Resident Evil 6 does have some of the worst enemies in the franchise. We're talking constant enemies that just sprout nonsense from the body, like you'll blow an arm off and it'll grow a shield. I know that sounds kind of cool, right? The problem being is, you've blew the right arm, he's grew a shield, that left arm's holding an AK-47, and you know how I feel about horror games and giving you enemies that have guns. It's lame, it's not scary, it never has been, it never will be. A gun in real life, sure, it's terrifying, but in a video game, in a horror setting, it just doesn't work. Give it some more claws, give it more teeth, make it sliver along the ground. Don't give it an AK-47. Resident Evil 5 had this problem. Hell, even one of my favourite games, The Evil Within, has this problem near the end too, where enemies have got guns. Just can't stand that shit. Now, a zombie holding a gun and randomly firing it as if it's trying to remember what it used to be, fair enough, I can kind of let it slide, but it's when the enemies are constantly shooting weaponry at you. It's just not necessary. But if you let that slide, and the fact that you can run and slide across the floor, and you've got all these over-the-top set pieces, it actually has a better atmosphere than Resident Evil 5. I have to come to terms with that. Leon's campaign is definitely the best of the three, but I don't mind Chris and I don't mind Jake either, depending on the mood that I'm in. I definitely play Leon's campaign more than I play the other ones, but there's some fun to be had, doesn't matter which campaign you do. You probably heard me say 3 campaigns, and some of you are probably going, yeah, but what about Ada's campaign? We don't talk about that horrid Ada campaign here. That is an abortion, and we don't want to mention that here. Whenever I play Resident Evil 6, unless I want achievements, trophies, I'm not touching that campaign. It's awful, and it shouldn't have been in the game. I get it, it's just more content. Speaking of content, Resident Evil 6 is packed to the brim with content. Some would say it's bloated, and I kind of agree. There's too much going on. There's too many campaigns. There's too many this. There's too many that. You've got the mercenary mode. You've got all the multiplayer modes. Hell, you've got that little agent mode where people can spawn in as an enemy while you're playing the game and attack you. There's a lot of things here. There's a lot to do. It's co-op. There's even parts where it can be 4-player because you can run into other people at the same section of the game with different characters. That never happens anymore, but it did used to happen when the servers were more full. Overall, I think if you play Resident Evil 6 like the action horror game that it is, instead of the survival horror game that I wanted it to be back in the day, I think Resident Evil 6 is actually a pretty fun video game. It's still, I like to think 4, 5, and 6 are a new trilogy, right? You've got the original, I know, you've got 1, 2, 3, and then you've got Veronica, and I still think Veronica's 3. You know what I mean? There's a new trilogy there with 4, 5, and 6, and I definitely think 6 is the worst, 4 is the best. But that doesn't mean it's a shit game. Arguably, it's got problems. Technical and story and just a lot of... There's a lot of mess with Resident Evil 6, but I'm just here to tell you that maybe you're a little bit too hard on Resident Evil 6. I think it's a fun time, single player, multiplayer, it doesn't really matter. Hell, even the single player doesn't have the problem with AI anymore, although it brings a new problem to the table where the AI just kind of like watches you die. At least in Resident Evil 5, if a Ganado or a Magini grabbed you and you scream for help, you press B, press circle, help, help. The AI used to run up and help you instantly. In Resident Evil 6, they could be stood right next to you and they are just watching you get your shit pushed in. It's just infuriating and annoying. But everything else, they don't have their own health, they don't die, they don't get in the way. Just pretty good AI overall. But yeah, it works no matter how you play it. Resident Evil 6, I've just got to accept it's a good time. I keep playing it for a reason. It's a decent game. It's definitely low tier on the Resident Evil scale, but what does that even mean in this franchise? It's a pretty decent game. Alright people, let me know how Resident Evil 6 makes you feel down below. That's all I got. I'll catch you later.